countless folks have glossed right over this one particular picture. It was taken on the steps of the United States Capitol back in June of 2004. A frail, hunched-over 82-year-old woman is standing all by herself next to a coffin covered by the American flag. You have world leaders, military brass, and the press corps staring right at her. Yet her mind seems miles away from that moment. It is as if the entire earth has been muted, leaving absolutely nothing but her and that wooden box. That lady was Nancy Reagan, and the guy lying in that casket? She openly admitted he was the sole reason she bothered to wake up every single day. The general public usually just remembers the superficial stuff, the signature red outfits, the psychic advisor, and the whispers about her pulling the strings in the Oval Office. But hardly anybody talks about her life after they left Washington. The massive toll it took on her, and how hard it was to keep breathing when he finally passed away. Here is that exact tale. Part 9. Queen Nancy, the absolute favorite villain of the nation's capital. If you want to grasp how things wrapped up, you really need to look at where it all started. She came into the world as Anne Frances Robbins in New York City on the 6th of July, 1921. Born to a theater performer and a guy who sold used cars. Her folks split up shortly after she arrived, so for the first 6 years she was alive, she ended up living with her aunt and uncle down in Maryland, while her mom chased down acting gigs. Growing up like that definitely leaves scars. It is a very specific type of isolation, when a kid knows they are cared for, but nobody is actually holding on to them. Things finally settled down for her in 1929, when her mom tied the knot with Loyal Davis, a well-known brain surgeon based out of Chicago. He legally made her his daughter. She adopted his last name and absolutely worshipped the ground he walked on. She went off to Smith College, gave the acting world a shot, just like her mom did, and ultimately scored a 7-year deal out in Hollywood with MGM. By that point, she was going by Nancy Davis, a solid, low-key driven performer who was doing decently well for herself in the business. Everything took a wild turn she never saw coming in 1951, which is when she crossed paths with Ronald Reagan, who was running the Screen Actors Guild at the time. The two of them got hitched the very next year in an intimate little wedding on the 4th of March, 1952, with just their best pals William Holden and Artis Ankerson there to watch. She was 30 years old, and he was 41. He already had a previous marriage under his belt with the actress Jane Wyman, and they shared 2 kids, Maureen and their adopted boy, Michael. Ronald and Nancy went on to have 2 kids of their own, a daughter named Patricia, who eventually called herself Patty Davis, and a son named Ron. Folks who were close to her back then will tell you right off the bat that being his wife became her entire universe. She practically built her daily routine around his calendar, his desires, and his career goals. So, when he decided to jump into the California political scene and snagged the governor's seat in 1966, she was right by his side, swallowing her first harsh dose of living in the public eye. Folks used to make fun of how she stared at him during his speeches, looking at the man like they were the only 2 people on planet Earth. The media dubbed it the gaze, and they definitely weren't saying it as a compliment. She didn't care one bit. By the time Ronald Reagan was sworn in as the 40th Commander-in-Chief on the 20th of January, 1981, Nancy strode right into the White House, knowing exactly what her mission was. Her job was to act as Ronnie's shield, keeping him out of harm's way, and filtering out anybody who didn't deserve to be in his inner circle. All the other stuff was just background noise. The folks in Washington didn't quite get it, though, and the pushback fired up in a matter of weeks. She had ordered a brand new set of fine china for the executive mansion. We are talking 4,732 plates and bowls that ran about $29,000, completely covered by private donors rather than the taxpayers. The visual on that was terrible, though, especially since the nation was in the middle of a massive economic slump. Her husband's team was slashing government funding right and left, while the incoming First Lady was out buying bespoke dishes decked out with gold trim and a bright red presidential crest. It didn't take long for the press to slap her with a brand new title, Queen Nancy. On top of that, she spearheaded a massive overhaul of the family's private rooms at the White House, borrowed wildly expensive dresses from elite fashion designers, and threw incredibly fancy state dinners, 56 of them, across an 8-year stretch to be exact. Those events were soaked in a level of Hollywood glitz the Capitol had been missing for ages. Her fans swore she was reviving that classic Kennedy-style sophistication. Her haters, on the other hand, figured she was totally clueless about the real world. She openly confessed that all those nasty headlines really broke her heart. Those initial few months, which were already defined by a tragedy that flipped their world upside down, turned into what she would eventually refer to as her missing year. That is because a mere 69 days after he took office, on the 30th of March, 1981, a kid named John Hinckley Jr. emerged from a group of bystanders right outside the Washington Hilton and unloaded 6 bullets. One of those rounds slammed into the president's chest, missing his heart by a fraction of an inch. A Secret Service guy, a local cop, and the press secretary all caught bullets too. Nancy was actually back at the White House when the phone rang with the news. At first, they swore up and down that her husband was completely uninjured. But her gut instinct told her they were lying, and she demanded the truth. When she demanded answers a second time, they finally leveled with her. She immediately rushed straight to the emergency room. Always the charismatic one, the president supposedly reassured her right before going under the knife. He famously joked that he just didn't remember to get out of the way. He wanted to lighten the mood, but she found absolutely zero humor in the situation. She remained glued to his hospital bed for 13 straight days. Things permanently shifted for the First Lady following that incident. She later explained that a subtle, constant undercurrent of fear lingered with her from then on out. Whenever her husband stepped outside to face the public and the flashing press lenses, she was terrified. Each event he attended seemed like a massive roll of the dice, and driven by an overwhelming need to keep him safe, she searched frantically for any method to manage a completely unpredictable world. She ultimately reached out to an old acquaintance from their time in the entertainment business, a star reader by the name of Joan Quigley. The chain of events sparked by that single choice, affecting the administration, the historical record, and her own legacy, remains a chapter that has rarely been completely unpacked. Segment 8. The Lady by the Bay, and the hidden truth the administration covered up. This astrologer wasn't some eccentric outsider. As an alum of Vassar College, an author with books in print, and a prominent Bay Area socialite, she even had a television presence. Actually, the two women originally crossed paths decades prior during a taping of the Merv Griffin talk show. Looking to the stars wasn't a novel concept for the couple either. They had both followed astrological forecasts dating back to their acting careers. However, the dynamic that developed following the shooting was on a completely different level. The First Lady began keeping in constant phone contact with her new advisor. She would lay out the commander-in-chief's itinerary, prompting the astrologer to analyze her zodiac diagrams, tracking how the celestial bodies lined up to pick out specific days that looked either lucky or dangerous. And the president's wife then leveraged those readings to aggressively tweak his calendar. Flights got bumped, media briefings were delayed, and takeoff schedules were entirely rearranged. Over several years, only a tiny, tight-knit crew had any clue this was happening. West Wing staffers would receive bizarre restrictions regarding the boss's daily movements, with absolutely zero context provided. A few employees became extremely annoyed, yet they still followed orders. Everything changed when Ronald Reagan entered the picture. Reagan, who shared a similar last name with the president but had no family ties, hailed from the financial sector after heading up Merrill Lynch. He originally joined the administration to lead the Treasury Department during the initial 4 years. Fast forward to 1985, and he essentially traded jobs with James Baker to become the White House top aide. With a demanding, highly structured personality, he never doubted his own power. Almost immediately after stepping into the role, he ended up locked in a silent battle against the president's wife. She constantly blew up his phone, offering unsolicited advice regarding the daily itinerary, obsessing over specific staff members or legislation, and dictating exactly what benefited her husband. The new chief found her interference totally infuriating. He would eventually remark that he signed up to manage the West Wing for the elected leader, not the spouse. The ultimate showdown was triggered by the Iran-Contra affair. During the final months of 1986, news broke that high-ranking officials had been covertly dealing firearms to Tehran, a nation that was technically facing a strict international weapons ban at the time, and then stealthily funneled those profits to support insurgent fighters in Nicaragua. This whole situation quickly blew up into the most massive controversy of the era. While the drama played out on the national stage, the First Lady decided the Chief of Staff had completely let the Commander-in-Chief down. She felt he let the mess spiral out of control under his leadership and lacked the skills to manage the resulting damage. She aggressively lobbied for his termination, but he dug his heels in. The two spent months planting nasty rumors about each other in the newspapers. Their bitter rivalry spilled out into the open and got incredibly toxic. By February 1987, the top aide stepped down or was basically fired, depending on who you ask. Either way, he left with a massive chip on his shoulder. During 1988, as the administration entered its twilight, the ousted official dropped a tell-all book. Inside those pages, he laid out the entire Zodiac operation with shocking specificity. According to his writing, almost every single significant pivot or choice executed during his tenure required prior approval from a Bay Area psychic who drafted star charts to guarantee the cosmos were playing nice. Even though he didn't actually name her in the manuscript, journalists at Time magazine swiftly outed her identity. That revelation exploded across the media landscape. The administration's press office admitted the First Lady was indeed talking to a fortune teller, though they vehemently denied that it ever swayed actual political strategy. The president himself strongly pushed back, stating plainly that horoscopes never drove his choices. When she released her own autobiography in 1989, she owned up to the habit, but argued against the public's framing of it. She claimed it wasn't about bizarre beliefs, but rather a frantic coping mechanism to protect her spouse's life after witnessing an assassination attempt firsthand. She penned that she was simply pulling out all the stops to ensure his safety. She emphasized that ordinary folks just couldn't grasp the trauma of seeing your partner nearly gunned down, only to watch him wade into massive seas of people day in and day out. Literally anyone in the crowd might be hiding a gun. Her anxiety was completely justified. The real debate just centered on if her approach was the right way to handle it. People still argue about that today. However, you absolutely cannot ignore the following fact. Once that information came out, the historical perspective on the First Lady's influence shifted forever. She shed the image of merely being a classy party planner and loyal spouse, emerging instead as a key political player pulling levers behind the scenes. Before long, those exact traits, her instinct to guard him, her intense dedication, and her readiness to go to bat, were going to be tested in a manner that absolutely no psychic could have ever foreseen. Prior to that unfolding, though, the couple needed to depart the nation's capital. What lay ahead for them on the West Coast turned out to be the most silent, profoundly heartbreaking era they would face together, ultimately cementing her enduring public legacy. Part 7. A drawn-out farewell, cognitive decline, and the fading president. Back in January 1989, the couple returned to the Golden State. Thanks to some well-off buddies, they bought a place over on St. Cloud Road, located in the highly exclusive Bel Air community in Los Angeles. They additionally took getaways to Rancho del Cielo, that treasured property tucked up in the Santa Barbara Mountains, a spot where the former commander-in-chief enjoyed saddling up his mounts, doing some yard work, and just being a regular guy. To the public eye, their initial post-presidency phase seemed like a perfectly relaxing next act. The former president delivered paid talks, and the pair showed up at fancy galas. Meanwhile, she kept pushing her substance abuse awareness campaigns via her personal charitable organization. Outwardly, everything appeared fine, yet his wife had spent decades observing him closely, catching subtle shifts that regular folks would easily gloss over. Right around the start of the 1990s, red flags popped up. He started blanking on people's identities way too often, telling the same stories twice, and having a hard time with incredibly basic tasks. She was already well aware that he could be a bit scatterbrained during parties. Historically, he covered up those blunders with a quick joke and his signature charisma. This time, however, something was definitely off. A deeper, foundational change had occurred. Fast forward to 1994, he delivered his absolute last formal address while celebrating his 83rd birthday at a Washington gala. He got through the talking points and the crowd ate it up, reacting enthusiastically like they normally would. Yet, once the couple headed upstairs to their room, he stopped, scanned the space, and confessed he had absolutely no clue what building they were in. Not long after that scary moment, she flew him out to the Mayo Clinic for tests. The medical team returned with the test results, officially giving them the diagnosis of Alzheimer's. To his wife, this devastating news just confirmed what her gut had already been telling her. Whenever you finally go looking for an official medical opinion, your intuition has usually already signaled that a serious issue exists. On November 5th, 1994, the former president penned a handwritten note to the country, using remarkably steady penmanship, to announce he was starting the path toward his final twilight years. That level of transparency was absolutely incredible. Hardly any famous individuals, particularly former heads of state, were ever that frank about facing a severe memory loss condition. As for the former First Lady, the upcoming ordeal was going to be completely unimaginable. Initially, things were somewhat manageable. The former leader continued taking his daily strolls. He maintained his sharp wardrobe, flashed that famous grin at strangers, and kept the deeply ingrained politeness that characterized his entire existence. Anyone bumping into him back then usually thought he appeared incredibly healthy. Underneath that polished exterior, though, the guy she had fallen for, the romantic who penned those sweet notes, cracked her up and claimed she was his sole motivation for waking up, was slowly slipping away. Certain mornings he seemed perfectly fine, while other times he woke up completely disoriented about his surroundings. Occasional memory lapses meant he completely forgot about his presidency. Tracking the current year became impossible, and he frequently mixed up winter with summer. His devoted wife stayed right next to him every night while the illness worsened, resting beside a partner whose recognition of her faded just a tiny bit more with every sunrise. During a private chat with a TV host outside their presidential library, she admitted this cognitive decline was far more painful than the time he got shot, since that attack brought terror followed quickly by a sense of safety. This condition was an entirely different beast. You were essentially losing your partner while they were sitting right in front of you. It was a gradual fading of her soulmate, bit by bit. She referred to the heartbreaking process as a highly protracted farewell. Countless everyday sacrifices inevitably piled up as well. Eventually, the former president had to give up his favorite hobby of horseback riding. A longtime security detail member carefully broke the news that hitting the trails just was not secure anymore. Witnesses say the aging politician broke down crying upon hearing the update. Yet he still tried to comfort the guy, promising he understood the decision, which made the whole scene infinitely more crushing. The family unloaded that countryside estate back in 1998, figuring there was zero reason to hold on to the acreage. From there, she launched into a 10-year stretch of absolute dedication, almost never stepping foot outside that Bel Air mansion, overseeing his medical team behind closed doors and guarding his personal pride with the exact same ruthless intensity she used to defend his political image. Along the way, she discovered an issue she became fiercely determined to champion with every ounce of her strength. Part 6. Picking her battles. The clash over stem cells and taking on the nation's capital. Seeing her husband fade away from dementia, transformed the former First Lady in ways that shocked those who just saw her as a traditional conservative spouse. She grew infuriated, not simply at the illness, since you cannot really aim your rage at a medical condition, but at the persistent sense that alternative solutions were out there. She felt researchers possessed potential breakthroughs they were barred from exploring, and partisan bickering was acting as a massive roadblock. The core issue centered entirely on embryonic stem cell trials. Back in the early 2000s, the medical community buzzed with real hope that materials harvested from early-stage human development might one day unlock therapies or total cures for severe cognitive decline. This field of study sparked heavy debate due to its origins, leading to a major turning point in August of 2001. That was when the sitting president, George W. Bush, issued an executive mandate that strictly choked off government grants for these specific laboratories. Right-wing voters and deeply religious factions within the Republican establishment loudly applauded this move. Yet the iconic conservative matriarch, raised by a strict Catholic stepfather, brushed off those ideological lines entirely. Her only concern was saving the man she loved. She started giving impassioned public speeches, advocating for broader lab testing, sitting down with top researchers, and relentlessly twisting arms on Capitol Hill behind closed doors. During an evening gala in the district, rumor has it she cornered Andy Card, the White House chief of staff, demanding he get the president to rethink their stance. The Oval Office refused to budge, but she refused to back down, eventually teaming up with a major dementia charity to launch a dedicated research facility in their name. Anytime she had a microphone, she argued fiercely that these brilliant scientific minds deserved robust financial backing. She took on this heavy lifting while navigating her 80s, dedicating nearly all her waking hours to nursing her ailing husband. This served as an incredible turnaround for a figure whom the media had long dismissed as a shallow socialite obsessed with designer dresses and high society. Through this crusade, she finally gained something that had always eluded her during her time on Pennsylvania Avenue: authentic, bipartisan respect from every corner of the country. Conservatives who loved the restrictive mandate, and liberals who used to mock her royal persona, suddenly found common ground. Left-leaning academics who generally hated her husband's politics rallied behind her, uniting the nation behind her deeply personal mission for a fleeting, surreal chapter. Naturally, this threw her into a massive conflict with her own political allies, though her younger son, Ron, already held left-wing views and regularly criticized mainstream conservative platforms. Then there was her daughter, Patty Davis, who stayed alienated from the household for decades due to ideological clashes and private feuds, making their entire family tree a famously tangled mess. Yet this particular crisis brought the fractured relatives together, even as the legendary patriarch slipped further away inside their Bel Air estate. Fast forward to 2003, the former commander-in-chief was practically housebound and needed round-the-clock monitoring. His devoted wife oversaw the nursing staff, handled his complex prescriptions, and dedicated massive chunks of her day to just sitting nearby, sticking by his side, even when his memory failed to register who she was. Stories from that era describe her reading aloud, resting next to him, and gripping his palm, practically locking herself indoors as the end drew near. At 82 years of age, she carried this immense burden mostly by herself, aided only by hired help and a tight-knit crew of loved ones at their Southern California residence on St. Cloud Road. One specific memory from those twilight days really lingers for those who paid close attention to their saga. The president's primary doctor, John Hutton, later claimed that the former First Lady's unwavering loyalty went above and beyond typical nursing expectations, which says a lot considering how selfless caregivers generally are. From the crack of dawn until late at night, she remained a constant fixture. Whenever he experienced a moment of clarity, she made sure to pull her chair up tight. Even when his mind drifted into total darkness, her physical proximity never wavered, a bond she showcased by releasing a book of their personal mail in the year 2000. The publication was titled, "I Love You, Ronnie: The Letters of Ronald Reagan, to Nancy Reagan. Flipping through those pages makes it painfully obvious what she grieved for long before he actually took his last breath. The guy writing those notes was hilarious, deeply sensitive, and completely over the top in how much he adored his wife. He drafted messages to her relentlessly throughout their union, sending them on holidays, during road trips, from the campaign trail, and right from his presidential desk. One particular note confessed that she was his missing piece, basically calling her the very oxygen he breathed, and stating that whenever they were apart, he was just killing time until she returned to bring him back to life. Sadly, the author of those beautiful sentiments vanished long before his body gave out. Ultimately, when the sun came up on June 5, 2004, Ronald Reagan succumbed to pneumonia following an almost 10-year battle with Alzheimer's. The former president passed away at 93 years of age. As his final moments approached, their daughter Patty shared that he suddenly unsealed his eyes, shut tight for days, and gazed right into Nancy's face. Patty noted a profound clarity in his gaze, holding an emotion absent for an agonizingly long period. To Nancy, looking back, that brief connection remained the ultimate parting present he could have bestowed. Part 5. Those 7 days the globe tuned in, along with the aftermath. The ensuing events unfolded into perhaps the most deeply moving and intricately staged national mourning period America had witnessed in generations. The former First Lady orchestrated the entire affair herself. For years, she had meticulously considered the honors Ronnie earned, envisioning the exact farewell he merited, and dwelling on the exact way the historical record ought to embrace his legacy. She arranged each tiny aspect of the 7-day national memorial, utilizing that hallmark exactness and authority she applied to every aspect of life. And the nation tuned in. The president's casket rested initially at his presidential library, before taking a flight to the nation's capital to lie in honor beneath the Capitol Rotunda for 34 straight hours. Massive crowds of everyday citizens walked by to pay respects. World leaders arrived. Past commanders-in-chief showed up as well. Margaret Thatcher, battling her own fading well-being, provided a taped eulogy instead of speaking at the podium, realizing her emotions might overwhelm her if she spoke live. At the heart of every single gathering stood Nancy. She endured pouring rain outside the Capitol building and remained solemnly seated throughout the grand memorial held inside the Washington National Cathedral. Her demeanor stayed perfectly poised, incredibly disciplined, and practically unwavering until those final moments during the evening interment ceremony at the Simi Valley Library grounds. Only then, at that specific location, did her emotional walls finally crumble. Pressing her lips to the coffin, she whispered a silent farewell, completely missed by the surrounding audio equipment. After accepting the neatly tucked stars and stripes, she returned to her residence by herself for the first time in 52 years. Their Bel Air estate remained physically unchanged. The late president's wardrobe hung untouched in his dressing room for a long period. All those daily schedules centered on nursing him, the attending staff, the health apparatuses, the rigidly planned days, simply vanished. A profound quiet filled that void instead. Companions and historians interviewing the widow throughout the subsequent decade painted a picture of someone so deeply isolated that it pained observers to witness. Her complete grown-up existence was constructed around a single man. Ronnie served as the absolute anchor for her every action. With that anchor ripped away, everything felt unmoored. She confessed to close pals how endlessly she ached for him, all while continuing to rest in their shared master bedroom. Framed memories of him decorated every available surface. Her conversations referenced him as if he remained right beside her, and honestly, in her mind, he never truly left. Yet she refused to fade into the background, which genuinely shocked the public. Part 4. Protecting the Legacy. The Last 10 Years. Mourning never equaled hiding away for the former First Lady. Through the period following her husband's passing, insiders began referring to her as the protector of his light. She morphed into the fiercest defender of both his historical record and his enduring impact. Plunging headfirst into duties at the Simi Valley Presidential Archive, her fierce dedication stunned even longtime associates who had known her for countless years. She consistently made appearances at major commemorative gatherings. Hosting visitors became a regular duty. Academics, elected officials, and international diplomats regularly secured meetings with her while paying their honors. Back in 2005, a massive Washington banquet celebrated her, drawing attendees as diverse as Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, and Harry Reid. This cross-party turnout perfectly illustrated her totally transformed public image during her twilight era. Come 2007, she paid her respects at the memorial for Gerald Ford. When 2011 rolled around, she took charge of the festivities honoring what would have been Ronnie's 100th birthday. Furthermore, she welcomed a pair of Republican primary showdowns right at the library grounds, taking place in May 2007 and January 2008. Despite pushing through her late 80s, she reliably stayed active in the public eye. Her push for advanced stem cell science remained a massive priority, too. Retreat was simply not in her vocabulary. While her personal crusade to cure her husband had permanently ended, she relentlessly pushed the narrative forward. By offering her high-profile backing and physical support to the movement, she realized her hard-earned influence could potentially rescue other households currently battling the identical nightmare she had just survived. Acquaintances hanging out with the widow throughout this era frequently pointed out an unexpected shift. For decades, critics painted her as fragile yet domineering and obsessive, someone quick to spark feuds and slow to forgive. Honestly, a fraction of that reputation was entirely justified. Yet, as her life wound down, that harsh exterior visibly melted away. Maybe the metaphorical shield she constantly carried for her perfectly polished White House role simply lost its purpose. The fierce, defensive posture she previously maintained was no longer required because her primary mission was complete. Conversations regarding her intense isolation flowed much more freely. She openly discussed the brutal reality of shaping your entire universe around a single soul, only to wake up completely adrift when they depart. Along with the bizarre feeling of attending functions where the crowd treated her like half of a partnership, even though she was functioning totally solo now. Simultaneously, her physical condition started reflecting the massive emotional weight she had been lugging around. Part 3. The physical toll of trauma. Physical well-being eventually slips away, along with those inevitable tumbles. Nancy Reagan was petite her entire life. Back when she lived at the executive mansion, people often noted her extremely thin, almost fragile frame. Once she reached her 80s, that perceived delicacy turned into actual, undeniable frailty. She battled breast cancer while serving as First Lady, having a mastectomy back in 1987, an era when people still spoke about the disease in hushed, uncomfortable tones. Taking a page from Betty Ford's playbook, she tackled the issue head-on, since Ford had bravely gone public with her own tumor diagnosis about 10 years prior. Many viewed Nancy's transparency back then as a massive contribution to society. Because she didn't shy away from the topic, everyday Americans started talking about it much more freely. However, as she navigated her late 80s and pushed into her 90s, far graver medical issues started cropping up. At her Bel Air estate, she took several hard spills that left her with fractured bones. Every stumble, every break, and every grueling rehabilitation highlighted the stark contrast to her Washington days, when she used to stride down the West Wing corridors with absolute, unwavering purpose. These physical setbacks remained closely guarded secrets. The former First Lady absolutely hated the idea of appearing weak to the outside world. After all, her agenda wasn't empty yet. The final, significant on-camera sit-down she gave happened in 2010, chatting with veteran journalist Judy Woodruff for a public broadcasting special. During the segment, she reminisced about her late spouse, discussed the presidential archives, and reflected on their shared journey. Her mind remained incredibly quick. Every word she chose hit the mark. The classic Nancy essence was fully intact, though she hardly ever stepped out into the spotlight anymore. This dynamic figure, who once threw 56 lavish international banquets, orchestrated a sprawling 7-day national memorial, and delivered remarks at the UN, now basically stayed confined to her Bel Air residence, surrounded by echoes of the past. Pals would drop by occasionally. Even her daughter, Patty, who had famously clashed with her mom for decades, feuds heavily documented in tell-all memoirs and talk shows, had gradually started patching things up. Sure, they would never see eye to eye on every single issue, nor were they going to sweep all those bitter, painful chapters under the rug. Still, they slowly bridged the gap between them, a shift that friends found both touching and, quite frankly, astonishing, considering their track record. Meanwhile, her boy Ron kept a tight bond with her as well. Her stepchild Michael, despite having his own deeply tangled baggage with the Klan, made a point to openly share his love for her following his father's passing. They weren't exactly a picture-perfect household. In fact, they never really fit that mold. Nancy herself never put on an act to claim they were flawless. Yet during this twilight era, her relatives truly rallied around her. That Bel Air property shrank into her entire universe as the end drew near. It was a tiny bubble, sure, but it belonged entirely to her. Part 2. The day the curtain closed. Early Sunday, March 6th, 2016. The former First Lady passed away, quietly, inside her Bel Air mansion. Her heart simply gave out. She had reached the age of 94. News of her passing was officially released by her representative, Joanne Drake, acting on behalf of the Presidential Foundation. It only took a couple of hours for heartfelt condolences to flood in from every corner of the globe. Messages arrived from sitting commanders-in-chief, past leaders, international heads of state, devoted fans, and ironically, even folks who spent their entire careers tearing her down. President Barack Obama, alongside his wife Michelle, put out an official memo sharing their deep sadness. Meanwhile, the 43rd President, George W. Bush, praised her incredibly fierce dedication to the nation she worked so hard for. Barbara Bush highlighted how fiercely dedicated she was to the man she adored, adding that she and her own husband found peace, knowing the famous couple would finally be together again. Arnold Schwarzenegger penned a tribute, stating she carried out her duties with an astonishing blend of strength, elegance, and pure dignity. Michael, her stepson, opted for a beautifully straightforward sentiment. She was finally reunited with the love of her life. 5 days later, on March 11th, 2016, she was laid to rest at her late husband's sprawling presidential archives in Simi Valley, California. The memorial service brought together 10 separate presidential clans. George W. Bush made the trip out. Michelle Obama showed up on behalf of the sitting White House team, while past political spouses like Laura Bush and Rosalind Carter also paid their respects. Hillary Clinton even took a quick break from her hard-fought Democratic primary run to be in attendance. Offspring of former commanders-in-chief, including Caroline Kennedy and Tricia Nixon Cox, joined the crowd of grievers as well. They placed her casket right next to Ronnie's on that iconic sweeping slope at the foundation, with a gorgeous view of the Santa Susana mountain range and the sprawling basin underneath. Her husband actually told writer Edmund Morris years ago that his tomb would just be a waiting room until she finally arrived, at which point they'd be locked in side by side, spending eternity gazing out at the ocean as a pair. She made it to 94. He passed at 93. Combined, they clocked in nearly 200 years on this earth, and with her passing, their epic chapter firmly slammed shut. Part 1. The Ultimate Cost. Looking back at a deeply complex figure, trying to truly pin down who this woman was, her true nature, her actions, the toll she took, and the gifts she left behind, is an incredibly tough puzzle to solve. Honestly, it's always been a mystery. She arrived in D.C. as an ex-movie star, famous for high fashion and a fiercely intense obsession with protecting her spouse. 8 years later, she walked away from the Capitol as arguably the most powerful, yet wildly misinterpreted political spouse the United States has ever seen. It wasn't because she held any official title. She never claimed to. But she fully grasped that staying close to the top and playing your cards right gave you an incredible amount of influence all on its own. She was the driving force behind ousting a chief of staff, and she didn't hesitate to pressure the folks handling international affairs. For years, she discreetly managed the commander-in-chief's daily calendar using behind-the-scenes methods the general public was completely clueless about. According to the most trusted sources, she gently pushed her husband to sit down with the Soviet Union, right when the administration's hardliners were dead set against the idea. Regardless of your opinion on her stargazing habits or her underlying intentions, those talks ultimately paved the way for the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987, helping to thaw a global standoff that had shaped her entire adult existence. She could also be incredibly image-conscious, fiercely guarded, and, on occasion, absolutely cutthroat. She engaged in very open rivalries, harbored long-standing resentments, and gladly weaponized the media whenever it played to her advantage. She was far from perfect. She'd be the very first person to admit that fact, and her strained dynamic with her kids provided plenty of evidence. Patty Davis didn't just spend years alienated from her mom and dad. She made a point to broadcast that emotional gap through a novel, an autobiography, and countless media appearances. That massive divide hurt absolutely everybody involved. Michael Reagan, the son Ronald adopted during his first marriage, carried his own messy baggage with the Klan, driven by a tough childhood that wasn't exactly Nancy's fault, yet still threw a dark cloud over how they all interacted. Ron Reagan Jr. completely walked away from the right-wing values that his mom and dad championed. Even when she was pulling the most strings in the West Wing, Nancy couldn't quite keep her household unified the way the public expects a First Lady to do. She constantly bore the weight of that huge disconnect between her polished outward appearance and her messy personal reality. Yet she also spent years faithfully sitting next to a husband who couldn't even remember who she was, holding on to his hand day in and day out. She spearheaded a massive awareness campaign focused entirely on the very illness that was slowly stealing him away. She was completely transparent about her battle with breast cancer back in an era when society expected women to keep those health struggles strictly behind closed doors. She navigated her 80s entirely on her own, a widow whose health was slowly failing. Yet she continually stepped out to defend a historical record that was already permanently set in stone. For Nancy, having influence was never just about Washington politics. It was deeply intimate. It was about having the leverage to shield what mattered most to her. And that was Ronnie. It was always Ronnie. And he'd been dead for 12 years by the time she finally passed away. She dedicated that entire 12-year stretch to ensuring his memory lived on globally. That was her ultimate sacrifice. But it was also exactly what she wanted. She once flat-out stated that her actual existence didn't start until the day she tied the knot with Ronald. A lot of folks struggled to wrap their heads around that comment, wondering how such a smart, competent woman could hinge her whole identity on someone else. She wasn't putting herself down, though. She was just being incredibly accurate. As far as she was concerned, that was the absolute reality of her journey, and she never made a single excuse for it, right up until her dying breath. That striking image of her outside the Capitol building, standing by herself next to the coffin, looking as if the entire planet had simply stopped spinning. She was entirely certain of her identity, and always had been, even if maintaining it demanded absolutely everything she had. If you got something out of this video, go ahead and hit that like button, and subscribe to the channel so you're always in the loop for more captivating deep dives.